Remember that massive bust-up in the Oval Office between Presidents Trump and Zelensky?
You will not have war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem.
That was when they were meant to be signing a deal related to Ukraine's natural resources. That deal looks like it is about to be signed now, months later. And also, it's changed because the BBC has seen a draft. We'll explain what's going on in this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Let's dive into the goings-on in Washington, D.C. We're joined from there by the BBC's chief news presenter in the US. It's Caitriona Perry. Hello, Caitriona.
Hi, great to be here.
And here in the studio is James Landale, diplomatic correspondent. Hello, James.
Hello.
Right, a few things to talk about. Caitriona, the GDP figures for America showing that the economy contracted for the first 3 months of this year. Is that the happy 100 days of your presidency present Donald Trump was looking for?
Well, it gave him something further to bash Joe Biden with, so maybe it was a present for him in that regard. He has landed the blame for those figures firmly at the feet of the past president, but obviously he does have to take a lot of blame for that himself. And to be honest, it's no surprise. Everyone was expecting it, including the president himself, by the way, who has refused to rule out the prospect of a recession in this country this year. But I mean, you don't need these statistics. You can see it around you in real life here in the economy that people are putting off purchases, particularly big purchases, because of the uncertainty that's here, created by those tariffs, created by the crashes on the stock market, and just a general unknown as to what may lie ahead.
Although the administration do put forward an argument for why tariffs aren't to blame for this fall in GDP as far as they see it. They do have a sort of a kind of claim about that.
Yeah, and they're talking about creating strategic uncertainty, and that, you know, the full impact of tariffs haven't been felt because President Trump has put a delay on all of this, and it's all part of a great master plan. And, you know, who knows? I mean, the one thing with these economic indicators is you do have to take a longer view of things rather than just in the short term, which is what we have now. But you can't escape the fact that the American economy hasn't shrunk like this since 2022. So it has been almost exactly 3 years.
James, the other thing that seems to be going on is there are reports that a minister from Ukraine is flying to Washington to finally sign this minerals deal. What do we think is going on?
Well, we certainly know that the minister is flying there. Look, there are various texts doing the round. You know, the BBC's got one. I've got a version here. We don't. There are other two. There's talk now of a main document and then two other documents. So there's a bit of confusion about precisely what's been signed and what's been agreed. There's certainly still some uncertainty about it. We don't know definitively whether this is the final one. There's some uncertainty about whether this is going to be signed. So there's still a lot of, you know, question marks. But clearly they're homing in on some kind of a deal. And what seems to be really interesting about it is that if this version that the BBC has seen and others have seen holds, then there's quite a concession from the Americans. Because essentially, the original drafts essentially said, we're going to set up a joint fund that will collectively exploit natural resources in Ukraine, so oil, gas, minerals, ports, pipelines, the full malarkey. You know, a massive investment fund. And basically, the profits would be divided half Ukraine, half United States. But Ukraine would start that process with a massive overdraft, one side, owing the Americans for all the military and financial aid given since February 2022. That has now gone, according to this latest draft. Instead, it's saying any contribution the Americans make in future to Ukraine, that will count as part of an American investment into it and therefore would have to be paid for by the Ukrainians or anything that comes from this deal. So that is, if that is how it ends up, that is quite a gain, quite a win for Zelensky's negotiating team.
And Caitriona, what's the theories in Washington about why that's happened? Both that there's a deal that seems slightly more advantageous to the Ukrainians than the original version, and also the fact that we're on the verge of the deal being signed when 2 months ago the whole thing was kiboshed because of the dramatic scenes in the Oval Office.
Well, it was described to me by a close advisor of President Trump, Sebastian Gorka, who's a member of the National Security Council in the White House on President Trump's team. He said that everything changed last week when President Putin, had that ceasefire over Russia, although that's disputed by the Ukrainians. And then there were several very serious attacks launched. And that's when we saw as well a change in language from President Trump in the last few days, that kind of warming and softening towards Russia that we had seen, that he's sharpened that up again. And he's just kind of come to this realization that President Putin maybe has been playing him a little bit, as they see it. And, the word being used is watershed. Things have changed. And so they want to get this deal done. They want something for the Americans, but they also are trying to soften their language on Ukraine and harshen it on Russia and get back to what would be a more traditional US foreign policy position.
And James, that's interesting because with Trump, you can't just take one thing as the proof of a new direction. There has to be a few things to prove that there's a new direction. And I would argue that the posts on Truth Social we saw in the last week or so, where Trump sort of came close to condemning Putin, in fact did condemn Putin for his attacks on civilian areas in Ukraine, that signaled a change of direction, but it was one thing. Can we add this apparent closeness to a minerals deal as a second thing?
Yeah,
that maybe there's a change of direction happening here?
This is. I mean, I think the minerals deal has always been a slightly different track to the ceasefire negotiations. So there is a sort of gap between the two. I think, and this is pure speculation because none of us know what's going on in Donald Trump's mind, but it strikes me that Donald Trump hasn't got many wins. He's in his 100th day week. He needs a few wins. He hasn't had many wins on Middle East. He had, an initial ceasefire, but that's now collapsed. He had some hostages released, but not all. And I think that if he did a deal that he could, sign a framework deal with the Ukrainians, and then he can go to the American people and say, you know what, I've got a deal with the Ukrainians. They're going to be paying us back for the military aid we're giving them. That is something to point to. That is something, and most people, I imagine, will not be on top of all the minutiae of the details. So it's possible that could be one bit of motivation that actually has changed minds in the White House. So let's just get this over the line. We were never going to get the full cash payback for everything that Team Biden gave. But going forward, it gives us something to talk about. So that could be a way through. But certainly, the one thing I would caution is compared to the document that I saw a few weeks ago when I was in Ukraine, that was a long, detailed, technical, legal document, over 55 pages long. The draft that we've seen on the latest framework agreement is about 10 pages long. So there are other gaps. So we don't know whether or not there might be something hidden there that actually makes this much more advantageous to the Americans than we've currently seen. So we lack of full information.
And that thing you mentioned at the start of the conversation about there's actually multiple US-Ukraine mineral deals, and actually they all have different ways of being implemented and ratified, whether it's the Ukrainian government or different bits of the Ukrainian state or even bits of the different American states.
Well, for example, the earlier drafts referred to a board that was going to be set up that was going to run this new fund. And there was lots of detail about how many members each side would have, what their voting powers would be, and effectively giving the Americans a veto over whatever the Ukrainians agreed. There's no reference to any of that sort of detail in this latest agreement, which is why I have a sort of slightly quizzical question mark over it.
Caitriona, I'm just thinking about, so James was talking about there about the Trump administration needing a win on Ukraine because they've been not doing so well elsewhere. That sort of reminds me of the conversation you and I had with Faisal last week or the week before, where Faisal was saying, well, actually, the economic chaos in the world might be quite good for the UK to get their prosperity deal with the US because Trump needs a win economically as well. Do you detect any sense of kind of like back-footedness from the Trump administration?
Definitely not if you've just spent the last hour watching that cabinet meeting, as I have, where they went all around the table, each lauding the other about what a fantastic and amazing job they're doing and how wonderful President Trump is and how America would be in such a dark, terrible place were he not CEO of the country and powering forward. Really interesting, though, just before we wrap up on Ukraine, they didn't mention that Ukraine deal. I mean, all the side chats here in Washington this morning and across Europe as well are, is this deal going to be signed? no mention of it. I missed the last few minutes as I came into studio here, so unless it was said in those very last few moments, but even Secretary of State Marco Rubio not talking about it. So I don't know what we can read into that. Does that mean it's imminent and they're waiting for a big razzmatazz unveil?
And just to interrupt you there, Caitriona, Newscast Supremo Chris has just messaged me to say that at the very end of that cabinet meeting, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, said, our side is ready to sign this deal this afternoon. So actually, we lured you away from the news and onto Newscast, meaning that you missed the news, but I then gave you the news on Newscast.
There you go, live and breaking.
You've
literally the last 2 minutes.
Sorry, Caitriona. Anyway, we're all on the same page now, which is good. But also, as we were all just been saying, it's like, what is it, that phrase, James? There's many a slip from cup to lip. Is that the phrase?
Yeah, no, there's many a slip twixt
yeah.
cup and lip.
Yeah, so Scott Bessent saying we're ready to sign this afternoon is no guarantee that this deal will be signed in the next 12 hours.
No, but if you remember, that meeting between the Ukrainians and the American negotiators in Jeddah last month, at that
Saudi
meeting,
Arabia.
the Ukrainians said, we'll sign today. And the Americans suddenly got cold feet because Trump said, no, I want you to squeeze some more. So there's been quite a shift.
Interesting. I'm doing Newsnight on Wednesday night because Faisal was meant to be doing it and is still in Canada with the new Prime Minister Matt Carney, who was actually the old Prime Minister, but he's just been elected as Prime Minister. And so I was just doing a pre-record with a guy called Andrew Wong in the White House, who is the principal deputy national security advisor, and I asked him about this speculation about the minerals deal, and asked that classic question of like, okay, you're offering some kind of economic guarantees, but are you offering security guarantees as well? And he said, oh no, economic guarantees are strong, this is what you need. And I said, oh, so it's just economic guarantees? And he said, it's not just economic guarantees, which made me think, actually, is there a bit more that America is willing to offer on security, or was he just talking about the fact that the minerals deal in an ideal world doesn't sit on its own? As you were saying, James, there's another track, which is the ceasefire track.
The Americans have always thus far refused to give any kind of indication that they will be prepared to be part of a European military security guarantee, namely this so-called reassurance force. They have, the Europeans are still lobbying hard, but at the moment the Americans have given no indication that they'll move an inch on that. But the Americans have always tried to argue that the sheer existence of a deal, a mineral, and we should really call it an energy infrastructure or resources deal.
Yeah, because it is other things as well.
We're talking. What matters here is oil and gas and the pipelines and the ports that are going to be built if this happens. And I think that the Americans say, look, if you've got American businesses, American workers digging stuff out of the ground in Ukraine, that will be enough of a deterrent to incoming Russian forces. That is a moot point. Not everybody shares that analysis. Because it's entirely possible that the Russians could say, well, we'll come in, but we won't touch the American firms, or they'll be. If you think about it, take, for example, Libya. Despite the fact you've had a civil war for many, many years in Libya, that both sides have managed to agree, by and large, not to touch the big oil plants and the processing things, because they know that whatever happens, that country needs that. So you can sort of ring fence big mining facilities and things, but Americans have always seen some kind of security support, if you could put it like that, by the existence of some trade deal, some deal, minerals deal. Not everybody shares that view.
Okay, James, I know you got to go, but Caitriona, anything else you want to just update us on in this diplomatic space?
Well, just as that cabinet meeting is going on, they're taking questions now from reporters as we're live on air here, and President Trump has built in a little self-protection for the next quarter, because he said if GDP is bad in the next quarter, that's still on Joe Biden. So always looking ahead and always looking to the angle there. But I suspect there'll be plenty more news lines out of that as the day goes on.
Is that a small hint that you're going to go and watch the news rather than sit in the newscast studio watching? Hint taken in the nicest way, don't worry. Caitriona, thank you very much.
Talk soon.
And James, thanks to you too.
Thanks very much.
Now, earlier in the week, I dropped into the conversation that the Climate Change Committee, the independent committee that monitors the government's climate change work was going to be publishing a new report about this thing called adaptation, which is how well the country is modifying its buildings, its infrastructure, its railways, roads, flood defences to cope with the changes to climate that are already underway because of climate change. Well, that report is out today on Wednesday and is interesting in its own right. But there's also another report out from Tony Blair's think tank, the Tony Blair Institute, which many people are interpreting as a swipe at the government's climate ambitions. Intriguing. The person who can untangle all of these climate stories is the BBC's climate editor, Justin Rowlatt, who's back in the Newscast studio. Hello, Justin.
Very good to be back.
Good to have you back, especially when there's so many climate news stories today.
Aren't
Which one should we start with? Because there's two main ones. There's the Tony Blair related one, and then there's the Climate Change Committee warning on adaptation. Which one do you want to take first? Or are they intertwined?
They kind of are intertwined. Well, should we start with Tony Blair?
Yeah. So basically, Tony Blair has this think tank called the Tony Blair Institute. They put out a climate change report this week. He wrote a foreword, and people have been interpreting that foreword as saying, oh, net zero is a bit unrealistic, and actually there's political risks to even pursuing it, which has been taken as a sort of swipe at the government, whose policy is to pursue net zero.
Making it more complicated, when you actually read what he says, you see that I'm not sure he refers to the UK at all. This is about the global situation. And he's really, the emphasis is on the need to tackle emissions rises in developing countries, what we need to do about that. So most of the kind of policy prescriptions he talks about says we need to invest in technologies like carbon capture and storage, nuclear power, AI to make our energy systems more effective, get rid of planning regulation. I know it all sounds like the UK, but he's saying that's what needs to happen in developing countries as well. So it's interesting the way it's been picked up. I think when you read it, though, you see there is some really quite provocative language in there. And this man is a master of the arts of communication. He must have known that saying that the net zero project was riven with irrationality was going to cause trouble. Or, for example, saying, kind of asking why governments waste so much time discussing things like whether or not to, stop using or phase out fossil fuels at UN climate conferences. I mean, I think he knows why countries talk about it and why it's important, and why indeed it was landmark that in Dubai the world came together and said we do need to transition away from fossil fuels. That's a global acceptance that that is a serious issue, and of course we cannot tackle climate change without doing something about fossil fuels.
Yeah, because when you read his actual forewords, you're totally right. He's talking at a global scale, and he says things like, oh, the developing world, technically China and India, they're not going to cut back their use of fossil fuels at the cost of their own development. So what's the point of telling them to do that? And you're like, okay, I've heard lots of people in the climate space make that case. It might be slightly undermining of the whole global climate effort, but you hear people saying that, mainstream people saying that. But it's a fact, he talks about people in developed countries, in other words, the UK, not being willing to pay for things that they don't think are going to work or are worth it.
Well, there's a couple of things there. First of all, when you look India's a separate issue. But when you look at China, it's invested more in renewables than any other nation on earth, and looks like it might peak its emissions, could even be this year, if not almost certainly next year or the year after. So it will be moving away, beginning to move away from fossil fuels. Yes, there are big questions about how rapidly, but here's a country that, frankly, is probably leading the way, proving that this can be done.
Well, and then also, if you look at the timeline of what happened, they put out this report. It gets picked up by all the papers on Wednesday morning. It's interpreted by lots of the papers, particularly the right-wing ones, as he's having a swipe at the government. Then you hear rumblings from government ministers saying, we consider this a hostile act from Tony Blair. You hear the same government ministers privately saying to their sources, oh, and it's the day before the local elections where, well, net zero and energy is an issue. Why has he done it now? And then you get a slight clarification from the Institute just before Prime Minister's questions, about 15 minutes before Prime Minister's questions, saying Mr. Blair is firmly in the same page as Mr. Starmer.
And in this context, we must also mention the sort of dark mutterings around Westminster. Everybody's all too willing to say, well, look at where the funding for the Tony Blair Institute comes from. And we know that over the years, they have accepted considerable contracts with countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, who obviously are huge producers and hugely dependent on fossil fuels. So, yeah, it is a murky picture, isn't it?
And the Tony Blair Institute have said on that point that they are editorially independent. And also, he's, as much as sort of the stuff he's said, and as much as all of what we've just said about what he said, he does also call into question the whole COP process. Yeah. And actually, there are plenty of people that call into question the COP process from good faith caring about the climate case.
Yeah, look, and I'm sympathetic to that because COP, isn't delivering, as much as one would hope it would deliver. But then imagine a world without a situation in which the countries of the world are coming together to talk about climate change. It's important that they come together kind of even if they're not succeeding. As I said, in Dubai, there was a landmark decision. Is the world acting on it adequately? No. But the fact is that they are acknowledging the scale of the problem, and one hopes that will inform policy decisions in the future. So it's not without merit. Which, look, he also nods towards that as well. It's not a complete repudiation of COP. He does acknowledge that, it needs to continue. It's probably useful, I think he says.
I think we can safely say the next time Tony Blair appears in public, whether it's on a panel at an AI event or doing an interview on a podcast like this, it'll be interesting to hear where he actually ends up.
Well, absolutely. And there's one big thing that really is missing from it. He repeatedly says how important the climate issue is. What he doesn't say, he says it kind of, the subtext is it's going to be difficult to get there. Yeah, we all get that. That's definitely true. What he doesn't say is, look, it's really important that we bear down on this problem, because if we don't begin to address climate change adequately now, we will, generations to come, and I always say this, I know it's boring, but it is worth reminding people, generations to come will face a much less hospitable world than we've enjoyed, and indeed the whole of human civilization have risen up in this exceptional period of climate stability.
And he also raises the whole thing, and you hinted at this, about investing in carbon capture and storage. In other words, technology that takes carbon out the atmosphere in a way that, like, way better than trees and swamps do it. And I'm just waiting for the moment, as a human being, when we can go, carbon capture and storage seems to be not just around the corner, but we can see it happening, because it's so theoretical at the moment, and has been for such a long time.
Well, the technology to capture carbon is well known and has been around for 100 years. The issue is, how on earth do you fund carbon capture and storage? Because if people have the opportunity to burn fossil fuels without the additional cost of capturing the carbon dioxide, they will do so. So you need a mechanism that says to people, it's worth investing in this. We do not have this here in the UK or indeed anywhere else in the world at the moment. And it won't happen until we've got that mechanism. That mechanism is some kind of a carbon price, which is a really tricky bit. I mean, most economists would acknowledge the best way to deal with climate change would be a carbon price, but it's politically almost impossible to see how a government could bring it in.
Right, let's talk about Climate Story 2, as if that wasn't enough. So this is the Climate Change Committee, the government's watchdog who marks their homework on their climate targets. And I remember when the new boss, Emma Pinchbeck, who's been on this podcast many times, took over, she said one of the things that she was going to prioritise in their work was this idea of adaptation. So what is the country doing to get ready for the changes that have already happened to our climate and the knock-on effects of weather? What have they been saying today?
Well, in a sense, let's just be clear. This is the sister kind of argument to the Tony Blair case. This is what happens as climate change continues to bring more extreme weather events to the UK, and what we're doing about it, or more specifically, what we're not doing about it, because Emma Pinchbeck has delivered on her promise on adaptation, in that this is the punchiest, most critical report on adaptation that we've seen. And let's be clear, every single report on adaptation so far from the Climate Change Committee since it was established, 10 years ago, has been very critical on adaptation. This one says, of a government that promised to take this issue seriously, literally, Baroness Brown, who runs the adaptation section of the Climate Change Committee, said, all I've heard is warm words. Where is the policy? Where is the action? She had a very punchy line. She said they're treating it as if this is a tomorrow problem. This is a today problem. If you leave it until tomorrow, it will be a disaster.
And we can hear Baroness Brown saying that in her own words when she's asked about what the Labour government promised to do.
The manifesto said it was going to address this issue of resilience, and yet so far it's done nothing. We've heard some warm words. There was a press release about more adaptation research, which said the government were going to look at objectives and targets, but nothing has come out yet. And this is a problem for today. It's not a problem we can put off for tomorrow.
So in terms of what the Climate Change Committee want the government to actually do, what is that?
This is That's a really good question. It's the key question. What the government has said, just quickly to get it in there, the government said, look, we've put forward £2.6 billion of additional money for flooding. Flooding is a key issue. Lots of us, 1 in 4 homes will be at risk of flooding. Half of our road and rail networks will be at risk of flooding by 2050, says the Climate Change Committee. Unfortunately, it doesn't end with flooding. It's a systemic issue for the entire economy. Climate change will change. We'll see more floods. We'll see more hot weather. We'll see enduring droughts. We'll probably have more kind of wildfires. All of these things need to be addressed. And that means changing the way our homes operate. It means perhaps changing the materials we use to build our railways. It means changing the ventilation systems in hospitals and care homes. There was a great example that Baroness Brown had for me. She said that Guy's and Thomas's Hospital in London, one of the big teaching hospitals in London, had an issue with really hot weather when the data centres went down and all their booking systems went down. They had to start booking all their operations on paper, massively slowing down. So the rest of the hospital was working fine, but they couldn't actually get patients in because it was all done on paper, and then it became incredibly complicated. And so, your data centres need to be heat protected as well. One of the things they say, quite interestingly, the Climate Change Committee, is they say, look at this huge investment you're making in green infrastructure. Where is the provision to protect that from the extreme weather that climate change will bring? So it affects absolutely everything. It's a huge systemic problem. And interesting from a political point of view, they're saying, look, is it right that DEFRA holds responsibility? So DEFRA, the department that deals with environment and agriculture, holds responsibility for ensuring that adaptation in the UK happens. They're saying, look, this is a relatively small spending department, which isn't hugely influential in government. Shouldn't the choices about adaptation sit with a much more powerful department? And by implication, I think they mean the Treasury. Shouldn't the Treasury be saying, with every spending decision, where's your evidence that this is going to survive the kind of weather extremes we can expect in the future?
But as we know from this whole area of politics, spending £1 today, to sort of misquote Baroness Brown, to prevent a potential problem in future is a hard thing for a politician to do when you've got an NHS that is running today, for example.
Yeah, tomorrow's problem is an issue for tomorrow's politicians. Today's problems are issues for today's problem. Look, I mean, I don't want to get kind of meta on you, but this is the problem with democracy and a long-term challenge like climate change. Democratic politicians, are held accountable to the electorate today, and they want to deliver for them literally today. They do not want to, as you say, spend money in the future. And that's a real problem for tackling a massive long-term issue like climate change.
And I'm annoyed at myself because I haven't had time today to actually read this report myself. But you've done a very good summary of it. But I think what strikes me from what you were saying is that in the last few years, adaptation has to me always seemed like a bit of like a gee whiz thing. Like people like you will go and see some innovative new flood defences and say something like, well, if this was rolled out across the country, it would cost £27.8 billion. But we now see, but by them giving that example of an NHS trust losing its booking system because it was very hot one day and the computer stopped working, that's making it seem like a much more real kind of business critical to every business kind of thing, as opposed to a slightly exotic sciencey thing. Yeah, which is what I think it has been in the past.
I think it has. And I think there is an increasing... I mean, it's quite interesting talking to climate activists who are talking about trying to rally communities around this issue of resilience. Say to them, you've got this... I mean, I was in a town called Tenbury Wells in Worcestershire. They've got a terrible flooding problem. And the climate activists are saying we can use that to rally people to sort of build resilience within their communities and use that as a way of getting a consensus that something needs to be done on climate change. So adaptation is becoming a kind of, more central issue.
So interesting. Justin, thank you very much.
Cheers, thank you.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one tomorrow, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.